Our buddy Second Thought, JT, who was on our channel to do an interview recently, um, just released this video called "Is Capitalism Really Human Nature?" Now, I thought this was a really good video. I really enjoyed it. I thought JT made a lot of good points, a lot of the same points that I would have made, a lot of the points that Marx would make. But there were just a few points of, maybe disagreement, or maybe I had something to add, or maybe I just wanted to expand on something he said. So it's around 10 or 11 minutes that he actually says some stuff that I have to respond or feel like I have to respond to. Most of this video is just really good. He's talking about this idea that capitalism is just the system that most suits human nature, is the most well suited to human beings. So that's why capitalism has developed, just because it's the most human system, and therefore it's like the pinnacle of human societies. And we can't have socialism because humans are just too inherently greedy. Second Thought makes a lot of great points in this. One of the points being that humans have the capacity for selfishness and the capacity for altruism. Marx and Engels say the transition from ape to man, when humans first became humans, was when we began cooperating with each other. We began cooperating with each other in terms of production, helping each other produce, cooperating in production, cooperating to protect each other from predators. And that's what allowed humans to become the most evolved and the most dominant species. But there are plenty of other examples, like people helping an old lady across the street when they could, get to work faster and make a few extra bucks or whatever. There are plenty of examples throughout human history of people choosing compassion, people choosing empathy over selfishness. But if we have an economic system that encourages selfishness, allows the most greedy and selfish to rise to the top, yeah, humans are going to appear pretty selfish inherently, because that's what we're incentivized to do by the system. But he also says, under socialism, under a system where the means of production are democratically controlled, you could have selfish people, right? It doesn't matter if there are selfish people. You're not going to be able to convince the community democratically that you should have more wealth and power and be allowed to accumulate more than everyone else and exploit everyone else and send everyone else to go fight in wars for conquest for you. Right? You're not going to be able to convince them to do a situation like what we have under capitalism. If the means of production are democratically owned, it doesn't matter how selfish you are. So yeah, interesting points. But that was about the first 7 minutes of the video. I'll play it here and I'll stop it when I got something to say.
And accounting. And soon enough, you have capitalism. If you've ever taken an Econ 101 class, there's a good chance you've heard this story before. Capitalism, for Smith, happens very naturally, and it all starts from the fact that this is just how humans work and interact with one another. It's a really effective justification for capitalism, because if maximizing profit through trade is just what humans do, and it transcends time and space, then every outcome of trade is justified. Why would we ever question it or get in its way? Morality is always changing, it's different from person to person, and nobody can agree on it. But profit-seeking is immortal, and it's part of us, so it becomes untouchable. But like I said, this was just Adam Smith's best guess. When you go looking through history and throughout the world, as David Graeber does in Debt the First 5,000 Years, this story of truck and barter becoming currency, becoming capitalism, just doesn't exist anywhere. The ethnologist Caroline Humphrey puts it really bluntly. No example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described, let alone the emergence from it of money. All available ethnography suggests that there has never been such a thing. Most of human existence until very recently was spent just giving other people stuff. Different societies in different parts of the world did things differently. Some would have central collection points where resources would be gathered and then redistributed. In other places, people privileged gift giving as a means of exchange. And almost everywhere, people just gave each other things and services either for nothing in return or the vague idea that the other person owed them one.
So what he's talking about here, in terms of Marxism, is what Marx and Engels call primitive communism. And this is discussed in depth in Engels' book, Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, where he talks about prehistory and the development of human societies way back. And yeah, it talks about these societies where people own the means of production in common. And most exchange of goods was, if it did go on, it was internal. But really, the society produced things based on what they needed, and then they distributed those things that they produced based on what people needed. So production was carried out for the good of the group. And studying these societies is what helps Marx and Engels, come up with the idea of communism, because these societies were essentially classless. They still had a division of labor, but it was a division of labor based upon your role in the family. The moms had certain jobs, the dads had certain jobs, grandpa had certain jobs, the kids had certain jobs. So labor was divided up like that, and obviously they produced what people need. And then obviously they didn't have the same power. They didn't have the same forces of production that we have today. They didn't have the same technology. But that's the idea of scientific socialism. That's the idea of communism. We return to the control over the means of production, the control over production and distribution that humans once had. Only now we do it with this incredible technological and productive capacity. We do it with the productive capacity that's come about through years of development and under capitalism. And we use it to benefit everybody. So we have the classless society that produces and distributes based on its own needs, and based on the internal needs of the group, but with the incredible technology and productive powers of today. Did I have anything else to say about that? Productive capacity, primitive. And he brings up David Graeber. So anybody who was part of our Patreon book club, when we did Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which joined the Patreon, by the way, anybody who was there for that, and anybody who's watching our series on Origins on YouTube, which I'll finish soon. I'm working on episode 3 right now. It's not done. There's 2 episodes, but either way, they know that I compare Origins frequently to David Graeber's book, the book that he's talking about here, about debt and the sort of debt economies that existed. Because David Graeber is an anarchist, so there have been people who argue that that David Graeber's analysis is contradictory to Marx and Engels. And people will say that David Graeber acknowledges that back in the day, during the time of, say, primitive communism, they had a sort of debt economy, meaning like, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. That was how they exchanged goods and services. I'll go get you some berries, if you give me a piece of the meat from the deer that you hunted. So the currency was essentially debt, right? You owe me. So people have used that to argue that there was no such thing as primitive communism the way Marx and Engels envisioned it, because there was money, there was currency, there was this debt. But Marx and Engels never says there wasn't exchange going on internally. And they never say that there wouldn't be a mediator of exchange under future forms of socialism and communism. And I actually think that a lot of David Graeber's analysis helps Marx and Engels analysis. It helps better inform Marx and Engels analysis. It just helps you get more specific as to what primitive communism actually looked like, what the currency, quote unquote, actually looked like. It didn't look like anything. It was just debt, basically a moneyless society. But yeah, that David Graeber book is good. I would encourage people to read it. Just make sure you also read Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which I don't think Second Thought brings up in this video. But yeah, I'm gonna contact him and tell him he has to read it.
Vague idea that the other person owed them one. Adam Smith's idea that people were out there figuring out how many bones were worth one really good stick, and this eventually turning into capitalism, is just not something we've ever been able to find historical proof of. What we do have plenty of proof of is that for most of human existence, we ran our economies on gifts and the common ownership of resources. Barter existed, but at most it was a very small part of human life, and one that you were pretty unlikely to ever encounter at any point in human history. The historical record doesn't seem to show that it's in our human nature to truck and barter, at least a lot less than it indicates that it's in our nature to work together and make collective decisions. And look, I'm not saying that we should limit our imagination for what society should look like based on what we think human nature is, or what we're able to find in pre-existing social models. I'm just saying that if your justification for capitalism is that it's more respectful of our propensity to barter, the historical record shows we are way more capable of doing things differently. Even if someday we find out that Adam Smith had a lucky guess and we did indeed spend most of history getting really good at trading stuff, that wouldn't make capitalism more justifiable, because capitalism isn't just about trade.
I mean, you could. He says, I'm not going to argue that, we should base any of our future social systems upon, human nature of the past. And that's true, but human nature as it's conceptualized by the bourgeois propagandists, right? Like human nature as this universal, unchanging thing that's always static, right? I mean, if we look back at our human nature and it did appear that humans were always selfish and we didn't have the capacity to cooperate, then maybe what these capitalist bourgeois economists are saying would make sense, right? But we look historically and we see that that's not the case, that, you know, humans have been able to evolve and advance more the more that we cooperate. So what does that tell us about human nature? It tells us that human nature is malleable. Human nature is always changing. Human nature is dependent on the environment that the humans are in. So I think there are things to learn by looking at the past and looking at, you know, quote unquote human nature. But obviously, he's not saying that we shouldn't do that. He's just saying this universal form of human nature shouldn't be the basis of our decisions for how to organize society.
Make capitalism more justifiable because capitalism isn't just about trade. Capitalism is an economic system where a few people own all the tools we need to make stuff. The factories, the farms, the machinery. In other words, the means of production. And use this privileged ownership to employ the vast majority of people to work and transform it into something productive. Trade is a small part of the equation, but Adam Smith makes it seem like it's at the core of capitalism, and that it comes from who we are as humans. The reality is that capitalism is an economic system that has only properly existed for 500 years tops. The first people of our species, Homo sapiens, have been kicking it on Earth for several 100,000 years. Neoclassical economists like Smith would have you believe that we stumbled on capitalism, discovered it, as if it were a fact of human life that was out there untouched, but informing the development of our species. These economists,
So that line right there was what made me decide I wanted to respond to this. Just because I know second thought, JT, is always open to learning, and always down for some comradely critiques or debate. But this might seem like a nitpick or a small point, but Adam Smith was not a neoclassical economist, like JT just said there. Adam Smith is what we would call a classical economist, which isn't obviously an easy mistake to make, but they're different schools of thought, and it matters for a few reasons. We were actually talking about the different economic schools of thought before I started watching this video, because I'm writing an article right now with Carlos about the neoclassical school, and about why the classical school went away, but the neoclassical school became so popularized at the end of the 19th century. So we'll just talk about the difference here. Smith being a classical economist, that means that he followed the labor theory of value, right? A lot of people think that Marx invented the labor theory of value, but it came from these classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Now, the original idea of classical political economy, and this isn't to say that the classical economists always adhered to this, or they didn't make mistakes, but because they did make a lot of mistakes, but the original idea was to explain capitalism scientifically, meaning using the scientific method, using observation, experiments, data analyses to see how capitalism works in its motion, right? Not just stagnantly, not just statically, but how does capitalism operate? How does it change? You know, how does it accumulate, concentrate, all these different things that capitalism does. So basically where they get this idea from is Newton and Newtonian physics. So they say we need to do with capitalism what Newton does with the natural world, what the physicists do with the natural world. You know, explain, like I said, its motions, its operations, how it works, what are its tendencies. So there's a lot of good work done by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. They're intellectually honest people, right? They're actually trying to found this economic science. And yeah, they support the emergent bourgeoisie, but they were transitioning out of feudalism at the time, right? Like capitalism was taking the place of feudal monarchies. So capitalism was the more progressive system at the time, as crazy as that sounds now. So, you know, you can't really blame Smith, at least. Ricardo came later, I believe. Maybe not. No, Ricardo might have come later. Either way, you can't totally blame them just for supporting capitalism. But either way, Marx took classical political economy way further than any of the political economists before him could. One, just because he studied philosophy and he was a really great thinker who basically read freaking everything that was available to him at the time. And studied economics and accounting textbooks and was just really thorough in his intellectual work. So that's one of the reasons Marx was able to take classical political economy further. But the other reason was capitalism had developed more, right? We had the Industrial Revolution was kind of coming to a close in Marx's day, and capitalism had fully taken hold as the dominant mode of production in Europe, and it was, moving to become the dominant mode of production in the U.S. And it would by the end of Marx's life. So he got to his analysis of capitalism could be a lot more thorough because you had all these accounting textbooks, right? You had all these methods that the capitalists were using themselves to measure value and how they circulated value, how they created profit. And, all that value, of course, stems from labor. That's how the value is produced. And Ricardo and Smith understood this. But then Marx looks at how this value circulates. How does it accumulate? How do the capitalists use it? How does value reproduce itself? That's a big theme in volume 2. So again, just takes the labor theory of value and classical political economy way farther than they could, basically taking it to its conclusion, right? Taking it, answering a lot of the questions that Smith and Ricardo were asking, systematically analyzing Smith and Ricardo, and not just saying where they were wrong, but pinpointing where they messed up in their analysis and why they were wrong. So he does this really systematic analysis of classical economy to the point where if you're going to accept the labor theory of value after Marx publishes Capital in 1867, you can't support capitalism, or you at least have to acknowledge that capitalism is based upon exploitation, which leads to accumulation, concentration, all these negative things that we associate with capitalism: wealth inequality, degradation of the masses, unemployment. These things are all products of capitalism. And if you are going to adhere to the labor theory of value, which economists had done for years and years before Marx, you have to admit that Marx's Capital was correct. There is exploitation at the core of our system. So what the neoclassicals do then, and remember, Marx publishes Capital in 1867, and then the neoclassical economists start coming to prominence in 1870. This new school, not the classical school, the neoclassical school. So this is why I say that the neoclassical school was a lot different than Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a real intellectual. Adam Smith discovered a lot of interesting and useful things that were helpful to Karl Marx. Adam Smith was trying to do what Newton did with the natural world, but for capitalism. The neoclassical economists are just bourgeois ideologues. They are nothing but mouthpieces for the ruling class, and the basis and the theoretical core of their system and of their method of analysis is so broken and hollow. It's really sad that it's even allowed to exist and that it has such prominence in academia. Like one of the things Radhika Desai talks about is that neoclassical economics has become the basis for all social sciences in the academy, right? So I'm studying healthcare administration, and there's this chapter in our textbook about healthcare economics, and it's neoclassical economics. It's this idea that the market is always the best, so you can't say, well, the market allows 40,000 people to die in America every year because they don't have access to basic health insurance. Well, neoclassical economics says the market is the best, so what can we do? Just shrug your shoulders and move on. And there's friction there between neoclassical economics and healthcare because there have been so many studies that say public healthcare systems have better outcomes and function better than private ones. But still, the basis of the economic analysis is neoclassical economics. And it's essentially a pseudoscience. There's, and this is something I studied not super intensely in college, but I took every economics course I could. And one of my professors was the head of the local GOP, big fan of Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman. But either way, that's who I learned economics from, and it didn't help me explain the world at all, right? And that's the thing with like postmodernist philosophy that Gabriel Rockhill says. Same thing with neoclassical economics. These academic fields, these academic pursuits that are just pure expressions of the capitalist ruling class, just pure academic expressions of the bourgeoisie. They don't help you explain the world at all, right? Versus you read Lenin's Imperialism, if you've never read any theory before, and you're going to have your mind blown. You're going to be, after I studied politics, for 4 years in undergrad, I got that book, and I'm like, this explains, what I learned over the last 4 years better than any of the books I read in the academy. Marxism and good theory, good scholarship is, fairly simple. It's usually not a bunch of academic gobbledygook, and it helps you actually understand the world. Neoclassical economics does not. It's just the pure expression of bourgeois economics that had to come about after Marx, because they could no longer acknowledge the labor theory of value without acknowledging that capitalism is broken and exploitative at its core. So they throw out the labor theory of value at this point, and economics basically becomes a method of price astrology. Just entirely focused on the sphere of circulation rather than production. Totally focused on maximizing the sale of commodities and markets, no matter how that affects the workforce or the labor force. And never talking about the working class that creates those commodities, transports those commodities. It's all about how to maximize market sales, and how to maximize or calculate profit. A lot of the main thinkers of the neoclassical school are Alfred Marshall or Hayek or Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman. And there are different branches. There's like the Austrian school. They have different names for themselves, but as Marxists, I think we should just label them all as neoclassicals. And again, the reason I stopped Second Thought's video here, the reason I stopped JT's video to say this, is because classical economics, and there were some terrible classical economists. There was like Robert Thomas Malthus, and some people that Marx has no respect for and he just destroys. But there were legitimate economists doing legitimate intellectual work, like David Ricardo and Adam Smith. They weren't intellectually lazy. But neoclassical economics, this propagandistic, pure expression, intellectual expression of the bourgeois class, does no serious investigation. It takes no serious scholarship. It takes no serious intellectual rigor. It's all just a bunch of academic gobbledygook so that people can tell you, study economics if you talk about socialism, so you can learn why capitalism's the best. Well, if you go study economics, you're going to be taught neoclassical economics, which is a pseudoscience that's just designed to tell you why capitalism is the best. So I sent earlier some of the really good videos. I'm writing an article right now talking about neoclassical economics and why it's pseudoscience. But if you want videos debunking it in favor of the labor theory of value, this one's really great. Paul Cockshot's video, Why the Labor Theory of Value is Right. And then also his critique of Alfred Marshall, who is one of the main neoclassical thinkers, where he basically shows that unlike the labor theory of value, oh, my screen is getting blocked by the CIA. That's not good. But unlike the labor theory of value, the utility theory of value, or what I call the subjective theory of value, that neoclassical economics is based on, is not testable, right? You can't test it scientifically. The labor theory of value, you can measure the amount of labor time in every industry, and Cockshot does this in his video. And then you can compare that to the price of commodities in every industry and see if there's a correlation. And there is. There's a 94% correlation. And where it's not 100%, it can be explained by monopolies in that industry artificially jacking up prices. Versus the subjective neoclassical utility theory of value, it's based on supply and demand, right? Well, how do you quantify demand? How do you measure consumer demand? You can't. It's qualitative. So then how can you graph it? You can't, which means it's not testable. They're just taking the price of a commodity, putting it on a graph, and then drawing two curves through it and saying, these are the supply and demand curves. These are what determine the price. But there's no proof that that's the mechanism that determines the price. There are supply and demand shocks that cause the price to fluctuate, but it just fluctuates around the amount of average labor time that was needed to create it. Average labor time is still the best way to measure the price, or what the neoclassicals call equilibrium, right? The supply and demand curves are literally two subjective made-up curves, and they just map the price of a commodity and then draw these imaginary curves on it. So that's neoclassical economics. It's absolute garbage. I'm writing a whole article on it right now. It's right now like 8 or 9 pages if you want to get more in depth on that. or just watch Cockshot's videos. His are probably better than mine. But yeah, Adam Smith, not a neoclassical. Adam Smith was a classical. And Marx brought classical economics to its conclusion, essentially. Neoclassical economics stepped in so that the bourgeoisie could still justify capitalism somehow.
First capitalist theorists set out to do for economics what physicists had achieved around the same time, discover a natural property of the world. But this project is impossible, because we made capitalism up. It's the product of a specific historical context. On the one hand, you had the growing power of a merchant class butting up against the dying power of a monarchical class. Feudalism was toppled over the course of a few revolutions and then exported around the world in a series of bloody conquests. And it happened not because we are built for capitalism, but because the feudal system just happened to set the stage for capitalism. Laws introduced the idea of private property, and technologies facilitating trade and production allowed people not born into nobility to acquire wealth. That's why we have capitalism today. Not because it's in our human nature, but because in a specific context it was the most efficient way to accumulate and then hold on to power. The idea that it was part of our human nature only came after.
So I agree with the vast majority of what he said there. You know, it's not in our human nature. There were economic developments that allowed capitalism to come about. Feudalism set the stage for capitalism. And then he mentions briefly that feudalism allowed people who weren't nobility eventually to start accumulating more wealth or advancements in technology and production. I think he should emphasize that point more, you know, because that was the key point in the development of capitalism, was the fact that these people who were in charge of the guilds, the manufacturing guilds, where they had apprentices and journeymen making commodities, essentially. They were commodities. And then you have the rise of merchants, the merchant class. So as production advances, as transportation technology advances and productive technology advances, these manufacturing guilds can make more and more and more. And the people who are at the top of the guilds, the guild masters, start to turn into capitalists. And then the merchant class is able to make more and more and more. And there's more and more merchants because there's more and more commerce. So in that way, it was sort of like a natural development of markets. Right, you need to acknowledge that feudalism was there and that feudalism set the stage for capitalism. But ultimately, we didn't invent capitalism. We didn't make capitalism up, right? We made up the justifications for capitalism. But capitalism arose because of class struggle and because of advancements and revolutions in technology within feudalism, another very specific mode of production. So I think his explanation was honestly pretty good. There were just a few things he said. Like one of them was that we made capitalism up. And then the other one is he said trade isn't at the center of the capitalist mode of production. Like Smith says, I mean, exploitation, right? The creation of value and then the sale of that value, or I mean, the paying of workers less value than what they actually create. Exploitation. That's what's really at the core of capitalism. But like I just explained with the development of markets and the emergence of the bourgeois class under feudalism, the emergence of these manufacturing capitalists or guild owners at the same time as the emergence of these merchants who would then become the capitalists, the bankers and the ruling class of capitalism, that did kind of come about because of developments in the means of transportation and developments in communication and developments in the ability to produce commodities, which kind of is the development of trade, right? I mean, the merchants literally were just agents of circulation, agents of trade, and who would move around what was produced by the commodity producers that would eventually become the large-scale manufacturing factories during the Industrial Revolution. So, you know, it was kind of I guess what I'm trying to say is it was less of a development that we made up. And I know JT understands this, and this is basically what he's saying. But it was not something we made up, and more something that came about because of revolutions in the means of production and increased commerce, increased trade, and increased markets. So when Adam Smith says trade is at the center of the capitalist mode of production, I do think he's right, actually, on that point. I do think that the capitalist mode of production is based on, like I said, exploitation, but then markets. Capitalism is the most highly developed form of commodity production, right? So like I said, there were commodities being produced at these guilds under feudalism, and then they were being sold in markets by the merchants. but it was still a feudal mode of production. The feudal ruling class was still the ruling class. There was still a monarchy. They still had lords and peasants. Once commodity production becomes the main method of production, once the peasants have their land expropriated and they have to move into the cities in mass looking for industrial jobs, once the bourgeois class leads the peasants and overthrows the monarchs, like during the French Revolution, then capitalism is enacted. But that only comes about with the development of commodity production. Like I said, the development of commerce and the development of humans' productive powers, their ability to produce commodities, is what allows the guild masters and the merchants to become a more powerful class than the feudal lords. So it's through the development of trade, through the development of commerce, and through the development of production that allows this new economic class to come about. So that's why capitalism is the highest form, the most highly developed form of commodity production. It's the development of commodity production itself that allows the new ruling class to emerge and overthrow the feudal class. It's what gives them the power, the economic power to overthrow the feudal class, because the monarchs and the feudal lords still had political power, right? But that doesn't matter because the capitalists, through the development of commerce and production, became the dominant economic class, which is real, tangible power. And eventually they were able to overthrow the bourgeoisie. Similarly, in America, the northern capitalist industrialists were one of the main classes in the Civil War that overthrew the plantation oligarchy in the South and turned America to a capitalist mode of production.
Our present hegemonic view of humans, as either a bloody, greedy, violent animal ready to descend into barbarity at the drop of a hat, or a rational, calculating, self-interested trader, came to dominate at precisely the same time as it became useful for giving legitimacy to the new political order. When capitalism emerged, it came with the myth that we are somehow incredibly rational in the context of a market, owing to our supposed predisposition to trade, but incredibly irrational and prone to violence in all other social matters. The natural solutions seemed to fit with the existing society: an economy organized by a market, coupled with a powerful state to keep the order, and the capitalist class at the head of the factory to keep us in line. So it stuck. It was endlessly reproduced as an incontrovertible truth, and, like the divine right of kings, became the myth that holds the justification for capitalism together. But it doesn't take much to see how contradictory this view of humanity is. It assumes that...
So this is really interesting. He compares the idea that the market is always the most rational way to do things, always the most rational method for distributing and producing goods and services, to the divine right of kings. And it absolutely is. It's absolutely the same thing, right? We just have to rely on this. It's a dogma. It's not based on any facts. It's not based on any evidence. It's not based on any empirical proof, just like it wasn't based on empirical proof that, we need to follow this inbred family who's put in charge of us because they're the king and they're the queen. It was just something that the king and the queen said in order to hang on to their economic and political power. It's the same thing with this idea that markets are rational and the markets are more efficient, and we have to dogmatically worship the market no matter how many senseless wars it creates or how many people it causes to starve or die because they don't have health care. It's the same thing. But like I was saying with my rant about the neoclassicals, both before we started watching this video and during, and with the new article Carlos and I are writing about the neoclassical economic school and postmodernism, that's the basis of their intellectual theory. That's the basis of their economic framework, right? And this is something that's not just accepted in academia, but like Radhika Desai says, in Western academia, neoclassical economics is like the basis for every field. Like I said, I'm in healthcare administration, and we learn neoclassical economics is like a chapter. It's like a piece of our curriculum. We learn this theory, this economic theory, based on the idea that markets are inherently rational and they're the best and they're the pinnacle. So we can't ever question the market, which is insane that it's such a pervasive idea that it's come to dominate the academy, the place, where there's supposed to be intellectual rigor, where new ideas are supposed to be discussed and debated, and we're supposed to throw out the outdated and ideas that have been proven wrong. Instead, the basis of the academy has become this pseudoscience, this economic pseudoscience called neoclassical economics and the utility theory of value, or the subjective theory of value, that says, you're not allowed to question the capitalist class, right? That's infected academia. And I mean, if you read like Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, about all the money that the Koch brothers have spent influencing the academy, all the money that capitalists and NGOs have spent donating to colleges in order to alter their curriculums, it makes perfect sense. It makes sense that the ruling class would control the education system, that the ruling economic class would control the superstructure, which includes things like education. But it's just really frustrating when you're in, college, or when you're attached to that capitalist academy, and, a lot of your contemporaries, and a lot of the people around you and a lot of the people placed in charge of you are just intellectual frauds, and it's completely obvious. But either way, back to JT.
It assumes that we are perfectly rational in economic affairs, geniuses at the grocery store able to make complex decisions and assess value on goods to find the perfect equilibrium between cost and return, but irrational idiots the second we have to make decisions about anything else, especially in the halls of government or academia. This is a useful contradiction for capitalist economists, because as soon as people act irrationally, meaning not like what their theories predict, economists can blame it on the fact that people are dumb when they aren't acting like the self-interest economic animal they expect humans to be, and their economic theories stay perfectly intact. Human nature.
Oh my gosh, that's so true. That's so true. The market always decides what's best. All right, the market is the only way we can do things, because humans are perfectly rational when they're consuming, when they're buying the stuff that capitalists sell them. But if you want to have a planned economy, planned by humans based on human needs, no. Or you want to have the government do something to help humans, no. Humans are completely irrational and evil and prone to dictatorship. And if we try and give people health care, eventually Stalin's going to be eating everybody's food. But when it comes to market transactions and, going to every time I go to the gas station down the street and I buy a chocolate bar for like $4, that is a rational economic decision, because it matches up with the market and it helps to decide consumer demand. And then they just make up this idea that consumer demand is what determines prices, the price of goods, so that they can have this whole dogma where, everybody acts rationally within the market, and then everybody's decisions are what determine prices, even though that's not true. It's labor value. Therefore, we can't touch the market because we have to allow people's decisions to dominate society. When in reality, capitalism isn't based on anyone's decisions. You think anybody wanted to have the 2008 financial crisis? You think anybody wanted to, kill millions of people in Iraq, other than those who were trying to lie the public into it? Capitalism does not make decisions that are rational for the whole of society. Obviously not. It allows millions of people to starve every year. But they just repeat this fantasy to themselves, like JT says, and if somebody pokes a hole in their theory, they just work their way around it. Or the other thing they do that JT didn't bring up, they also blame it on the government, right? Like, oh, people don't have health care. Well, that's because of Medicare and Medicaid. Like, well, Medicare and Medicaid are the most well-liked forms of healthcare payment in the country, right? They're the only public forms of healthcare that we have, or healthcare payment that we have, and they're more well-liked than the private ones. And I don't even know what argument people make to explain around that, but what they'll say is, well, the private ones would work better, but Medicare and Medicaid are driving the prices up, even though it's the opposite. Or they would work better, but they have to pay taxes for Medicare and Medicaid. Just these ridiculous arguments where it's somehow always the government's fault. And then the government under capitalism is a dictatorship of capital, right? It's not designed to work for you. It's designed to screw you over and help funnel wealth and labor value to the ruling class. So then when that government doesn't do anything for workers, the neoclassicals say, see, the government doesn't work. We got to get rid of the government. But then, for some reason, they're always okay with the government writing another check for the military, or the government bailing out the big banks after a crisis. They're always cool with the government doing stuff for them. But then, any inefficiencies with the market, that's actually somehow the government's fault. I don't know. Just trust me, bro. That's neoclassical economics in a nutshell. Just trust me, bro.
Is a safety valve for capitalist economics, a heuristic that can be used to model a society that just happens to benefit capitalists and simultaneously can find a justification when the model fails to explain reality. And at this point in the video, I want to bring us back to socialism. A lot of the misconception about the impact of human nature on socialism comes from the fact that socialism is often poorly defined. Socialism, when we talk about human nature, is often viewed as a society where everything is the same as it is right now, except that people share. That is not what socialism is. And it's easy to see how one greedy, selfish, or cruel person could completely ruin it if socialism depended on people being nice and the honor system. But in reality, socialism, at the economic level, isn't about sharing. It's a society where if everybody needs something, it's owned collectively, and we all get to decide how it's distributed. The means of production are held in common and subject to democratic control. Instead of individual business owners making decisions about production to serve their self-interest and submitting them to the market for review, and so be it if some people get none and others get almost everything, under socialism, the things that affect all of us are decided by all of us. This can take many forms. For example, banks could fund business projects on the basis of a democratic mandate, instead of venture capitalists and for-profit banks calling the shots. Businesses could be run by the people who work there, and who either elect their boss or make strategic decisions by vote, instead of your boss just being some random guy with money. Your town could hold meetings where people point out what's missing and devise ways to fill the gaps, instead of waiting around and hoping someone will find a way to solve the problem in a profitable way. Trade wouldn't disappear, but profit would. You can be as selfish as you want in this context, but good luck convincing everyone else to prioritize your needs at the expense of everyone else's. Without the power to withhold something from someone else because you're the sole owner, what you'll find is that these systems reward those who collaborate.
That is such a good point, too. He makes so many good points that are just like, sometimes we forget to make them as Marxists because we're so into the reading and we get so into the weeds of this stuff. We want to make the most complex arguments or points. At least people in academia or like intellectuals. But JT just speaks to the masses, I feel like. He makes these wonderful points like that. Like, yeah, you can be selfish under socialism. Good luck convincing everybody to let you hoard the resources and let you hoard the wealth and exploit all of them in order to get any of the resources and the wealth that you're hoarding, which is how capitalism works. If the means of production are democratically owned, nobody's going to let you do that, right? Cooperation is going to be encouraged. And that's such a good point, you know, and definitely not one that I would have thought to make. So excellent video there from JT. I mostly just wanted to hit on the part about where he said Adam Smith is neoclassical. I mostly just wanted to explain that misconception so I could talk about classical economics versus neoclassical economics, because a lot of the stuff that he talked about here applies to neoclassical economics, right? A lot of these ideas about human nature and about how capitalism came about and about the infallibility of the market. You know, a lot of that stems from neoclassical economists who just look at capitalism as universal and look at it in isolation. You know, they don't see it as a product of history, because if capitalism has an origin, that implies that it has an end. And the neoclassical economists can't do that because they have a religion, not a science. So they just completely ignore history. But that's not true of the classical economists, right? The classical economists were necessary for Marx in order to figure a lot of stuff out. No Adam Smith and no David Ricardo. I don't know. Marx might have still been Marx, but it would have been more difficult for him. Yeah, so a little comradely critique action. Sometimes I've been going back and rewatching my videos recently on YouTube, which I don't always do. And like, I like that I get fired up and I get into the videos, right? But some of the, sometimes I get so mad. Like, I'm listening to myself and I'm just like ranting and screaming and just like frothing at the mouth about these like dumb neoclassical economists or these bourgeois propagandists or these bourgeois psychologists like Jordan Peterson or whatever. I'm just watching Voosh or Vaush or whatever freaking cringeworthy video y'all have sent me in the chat to torture me with today. And sometimes I just want to chill out. Sometimes I want to chill out. I want to acknowledge where people are right. I want to acknowledge people who are doing good things. And, you know, there's no reason I can't make a video responding to JT, where I agree with 99.9% of what he said in the video, and then point out the 1% of the things that I didn't agree with or, you know, wanted to correct. Right? There's no reason I have to watch only Vaush videos that I 99% disagree with and that just make me want to bash my head through the desk. I think in the last stream, I said I was going to jump out of the window, and it's a first story window, you know, so I would be all right if I jumped out of the window. Like, you know, I'm like 2 feet off the ground. But either way, I said I was going to jump out of the window, hypothetically, like 4 times. And y'all did send me some terrible videos last week, but I'm going to mix it up now. I'm going to listen to some good ones.